The avoidance hot and cold behavior isn't random, isn't about you, and isn't something you can fix by being more understanding, more patient, or more accommodating. It's a pattern rooted in their attachment wounds, driven by their nervous system's oscillation between craving connection and fearing engulfment, designed unconsciously to keep intimacy at a manageable distance, where they never feel too close or too far. Most people respond to this pattern in ways that ensure it continues. They pursue during the cold phases. They overflow with relief during the warm phases. They adjust their expectations downward to accommodate the inconsistency. They blame themselves for the avoidance withdrawal. These responses don't break the cycle. They reinforce it, teaching the avoidant that their hot and cold behavior is an effective strategy for managing relationship intensity without consequence. Outsmarting the avoidant doesn't mean manipulating them or playing games. It means understanding their pattern clearly enough that you stop participating in the dynamics that enable it, protecting yourself from the emotional damage the cycle creates, and responding in ways that either force the avoidant to examine their behavior or make it clear that you won't remain available for a relationship structure that fundamentally doesn't work. This requires you to shift from being reactive to being strategic, from being accommodating to being boundaried, from hoping the pattern will change to accepting what the pattern reveals about the avoidance capacity and making decisions accordingly. Recognize the pattern before you're trapped in it. The first step in outsmarting the avoidance hot and cold behavior is recognizing the pattern early, ideally before you're emotionally invested enough that leaving feels impossible and before you've adjusted your entire life to accommodate their inconsistency. The pattern has predictable features that appear across relationships with avoidance, and learning to identify these features protects you from months or years of confusion and pain. Recognition creates the psychological distance necessary to see clearly what's happening rather than getting lost in the emotional intensity of each hot and cold phase. The pattern typically begins with an intense early connection that feels different from other relationships you've experienced. The avoidant is present, engaged, and emotionally available in ways that create powerful bonding. This isn't fake. The avoidant genuinely feels the connection during this phase because commitment is distant enough that their defenses haven't fully activated. But this early intensity establishes a baseline that becomes your reference point for what the relationship can be. And this baseline is what keeps you hoping and waiting through all the subsequent cold phases. Recognizing that the early intensity is often unsustainable rather than representative of what the avoidant can maintain helps you adjust your expectations and assess the relationship based on the overall pattern rather than on the best moments. The first cold phase arrives when intimacy reaches a threshold that triggers the avoidance discomfort. This might be after you've spent several consecutive days together, after emotional vulnerability has been exchanged, after future plans have been discussed, or after the relationship has been defined in ways that feel more committed. The avoidant doesn't typically announce they're withdrawing. They simply become less available, less responsive, and less emotionally present. Messages slow down, plans become vague. The warmth that characterized the early phase cools noticeably. Recognizing this shift as a pattern rather than as a temporary response to external stresses helps you see what's actually happening rather than creating explanations that protect the avoidant from accountability. The pattern recognition also involves noticing what brings the avoidant back to warmth. Often, it's your distance or your decreased pursuit that triggers their return. When you stop chasing, when you redirect your energy elsewhere, when you seem to be moving on, the avoidant experiences the threat of loss and moves back toward warmth. This response reveals that the cold phase isn't about needing space from you specifically. It's about managing their discomfort with intimacy. When intimacy increases, they create distance. When distance risks becoming permanent loss, they recreate intimacy. This cycle has nothing to do with your behavior and everything to do with their internal regulation of closeness. Recognizing the pattern means tracking not just the individual hot and cold phases, but the cycle itself. How long each phase typically lasts, what seems to trigger the shifts, and whether the pattern is intensifying or remaining stable over time. Many people in relationships with avoidance find that the warm phases get shorter and the cold phases get longer as the relationship continues. This deterioration happens because the avoidant becomes more comfortable taking your presence for granted, less concerned about losing you, and more confident that you'll tolerate the inconsistency. Tracking this trajectory helps you see whether the relationship is actually sustainable or whether you're on a path toward increasing dysfunction. The pattern recognition also involves noticing how you feel during the different phases. During the warm phases, you feel relieved, hopeful, and connected, like the relationship is finally working. During the cold phases, you feel anxious, confused, and hurt, like you've done something wrong. This emotional roller coaster is itself a sign of the pattern. Healthy relationships create relatively stable emotional experiences with normal fluctuations. Relationships with avoidance create dramatic swings between emotional highs and lows that leave you perpetually off balance. Recognizing that this emotional instability is a feature of the pattern rather than a temporary difficulty helps you assess whether this is a relationship structure you can sustain long term. Early pattern recognition also means identifying your own responses that enable the cycle. Do you pursue during cold phases? Do you suppress your hurt to avoid pushing them further away? Do you overflow with gratitude when they return to warmth? Do you adjust your expectations downward to accommodate their inconsistency? These responses are understandable, but they reinforce the pattern by removing consequences for the avoidance behavior and by communicating that their hot and cold behavior is acceptable to you. Recognizing your own role in maintaining the cycle is crucial for changing your responses in ways that protect you. The key to early recognition is trusting your gut when something feels off, when the inconsistency creates confusion, when you find yourself constantly trying to figure out where you stand. The avoidant pattern often makes you doubt your own perceptions. It makes you question whether you're being too sensitive or demanding. But if you feel like you're on an emotional roller coaster, if you're never quite sure where the relationship stands, if the avoidance availability feels unpredictable and anxiety-inducing, trust that perception. It's showing you a pattern that will continue unless something fundamental changes. Early recognition gives you the option to protect yourself before you're too invested to leave easily. Stop reacting to their temperature changes. The second strategy for outsmarting the avoidance hot and cold behavior is eliminating the reactive responses that the pattern is designed to elicit from you. The avoidance cycle works because it creates predictable reactions: pursuit during withdrawal, relief during return, and constant adjustment of your behavior trying to keep them close. These reactions give the avoidant control over the relationship's emotional temperature while ensuring you remain engaged regardless of how they're behaving. Stopping these reactions disrupts the pattern by removing the reinforcement the avoidant receives for their inconsistency. Stopping your reactions begins with not pursuing when the avoidant goes cold. This is the most difficult response to eliminate because the cold phase triggers anxiety, fear of abandonment, and a desperate need to restore connection. Every instinct tells you to reach out, to fix whatever went wrong, to bridge the distance they've created. But pursuit during the avoidance withdrawal is exactly what they're unconsciously or consciously counting on. It confirms that their distancing strategy works, that they can regulate intimacy through withdrawal, and that you'll do the work of maintaining connection while they manage their discomfort. Stopping pursuit means allowing the distance they've created to exist without trying to close it, continuing to focus on your own life while they're unavailable, and refusing to organize your schedule and emotional state around their absence. Stopping your reactions also means not flooding with relief and gratitude when the avoidant returns to warmth. When they resurface after a cold phase, your instinct is to be welcoming, to show how happy you are that they're back, to immediately reestablish the intimacy that existed before they withdrew. This reaction rewards their return without requiring any acknowledgement of the rupture they created, any accountability for their withdrawal, or any commitment to different behavior in the future. Instead of relief, meet their return with neutral cordiality. You're not punishing them, you're simply not rewarding behavior that hurt you. You're treating their inconsistency as information about their capacity, rather than as something to celebrate when it temporarily improves. Eliminating reactive responses includes not adjusting your plans in life to accommodate the avoidant's unpredictable availability. When they go cold, don't put your life on hold waiting for them to warm up again. When they're warm, don't cancel other commitments to maximize time with them before they inevitably withdraw again. Maintain your own schedule, your own commitments, and your own life structure, regardless of what temperature the avoidant is displaying. This consistency protects you from the chaos of organizing around their inconsistency, and it communicates that their availability determines their access to you, but not the structure of your life. Stopping reactions also means not engaging in the emotional processing and analysis that the hot and cold pattern typically triggers. You're not spending hours trying to figure out what caused the shift, what you did wrong, or how you can prevent future withdrawal. You're not replaying interactions looking for your mistakes. You're not constructing elaborate theories about their behavior. This mental activity is exhausting and pointless because the pattern isn't about you. It's about their attachment wounds and their capacity for sustained intimacy. Reducing the mental energy you devote to understanding their temperature changes frees that energy for your own growth and well-being. Eliminating reactive responses includes not defending yourself when the avoidant blames their withdrawal on you. Often, when you address the cold phase, the avoidant will suggest that you were too demanding, too needy, or too intense, that your behavior triggered their need for space. Your reactive response would be to defend yourself, to explain that you weren't being unreasonable, to adjust your behavior to prevent future withdrawal. But this defense accepts the premise that their withdrawal is your fault, that you have control over their temperature changes, and that you can prevent the pattern by managing yourself better. Instead, recognize that their withdrawal is about their patterns, not about your behavior, and refuse to take responsibility for their inability to maintain consistent presence. Stopping your reactions also means not accepting the avoidance return without addressing the pattern. When they come back warm after a cold phase, the reactive response is to pick up where you left off, grateful they returned and afraid to rock the boat by addressing the rupture. But accepting their return without discussion teaches them that withdrawal has no consequences, that they can disappear and reappear at will without accountability. Instead, make addressing the pattern a condition of continuing the relationship. This doesn't mean punishment or ultimatums necessarily. It means honest conversation about the impact their behavior has on you and clear communication about what needs to change for the relationship to be sustainable. The goal of stopping reactive responses is to break the predictable cycle where the avoidant controls intimacy through temperature changes and you adapt to those changes while maintaining the relationship. When you stop reacting predictably, when your responses no longer follow the script the pattern depends on, the avoidant faces a new situation. They can't take your presence for granted. They can't assume you'll pursue during withdrawal or accept their return without question. They must either address their patterns to maintain the relationship or face the consequence of you becoming increasingly unavailable and disengaged. Either outcome is better for you than continuing to react in ways that enable dysfunction while sacrificing your own well-being. Establish consequences that protect your well-being. The third strategy for outsmarting the avoidance hot and cold behavior is establishing real consequences that protect you from the pattern's damage, regardless of whether those consequences motivate the avoidant to change. Most people remain consequence-free zones for avoidance. The avoidant can cycle through hot and cold indefinitely while you continue to accept it, accommodate it, and wait through it. This lack of consequences ensures the pattern continues because the avoidant faces no cost for their behavior. Establishing consequences doesn't mean punishing the avoidant or manipulating them through ultimatums. It means protecting yourself by creating boundaries that limit your exposure to behavior that harms you. The consequences begin with emotional protection that reduces how much you invest in the relationship relative to what you receive. If the avoidant is inconsistent, you become inconsistent in your investment. If they're emotionally available only part of the time, you redirect emotional energy that was focused on them toward other relationships, pursuits, and sources of fulfillment. This isn't about withholding to manipulate their behavior. It's about recognizing that full investment in someone who's only partially available is self-abandonment. You're matching their energy rather than always giving more than you receive, and this matching protects you from the depletion of one-sided investment. Establishing consequences also means implementing time boundaries around how long you'll tolerate the pattern without change. You're not waiting indefinitely to see if the avoidant becomes more consistent. You're giving the relationship a defined period, weeks or months, depending on its history, during which you observe whether the avoidant is doing genuine work to address their patterns. If that period passes without meaningful change, without evidence of therapy or serious examination of their behavior, and without improvement in their consistency, you make decisions that prioritize your well-being. This might mean downgrading the relationship from committed partnership to casual connection, or it might mean ending it entirely. The time boundary protects you from years of waiting for change that never materializes. The consequences include reducing your availability when the pattern continues. If the avoidant goes cold and then returns expecting to resume intimacy without addressing the rupture, you're less available than you were before. You have plans, you're busy, and your schedule doesn't accommodate them as easily. This consequence communicates that their pattern is eroding your investment, that each cycle makes you less accessible, and that continuing the behavior will result in losing proximity to you. The avoidant may interpret this as you being distant or cold, but you're simply protecting yourself from the damage of continuing to be fully available to someone who's inconsistently available to you. Establishing consequences also means ending interactions when the avoidant behaves in ways that violate your boundaries. If they're dismissive of your concerns, if they minimize your hurt, if they blame you for their withdrawal, you disengage from the conversation. You don't continue trying to be heard, don't keep explaining your perspective, and don't accept treatment that's disrespectful or invalidating. You simply remove yourself from the situation, creating a consequence where their behavior results in immediate loss of your presence. This consequence teaches that mistreating you ends the interaction, not that explaining yourself better will make them understand. The consequences include refusing to function as the relationship's sole maintainer. If you're doing all the work of initiating contact, making plans, bringing up important conversations, and maintaining emotional connection, you stop. You initiate less. You wait to see if the avoidant steps up. You allow gaps in contact to exist without filling them. This consequence reveals whether the avoidant is capable of reciprocal effort or whether the relationship only functions when you're doing most of the work. If they don't step up, you've learned crucial information about their capacity. If they do step up, you've created a more balanced dynamic. Establishing consequences also means being willing to end a relationship if the pattern continues without change. This willingness isn't about threatening the avoidant or trying to scare them into better behavior. It's about genuinely accepting that if they can't or won't address their hot and cold pattern, the relationship isn't sustainable for you. This consequence, the possibility of permanent loss, is often the only thing powerful enough to motivate an avoidant to do serious work on their patterns. But it only works as motivation if you're truly willing to follow through, if you value yourself enough to leave a relationship that consistently fails to meet your needs. The consequences you establish should primarily serve your protection rather than the avoidance motivation. Whether or not these consequences inspire the avoidant to change their behavior, they should improve your experience by reducing your exposure to harmful patterns, by protecting your emotional energy and investment, and by ensuring you don't sacrifice years of your life to someone who may never develop the capacity for sustained intimacy. The consequences create conditions where either the relationship becomes healthier or you exit before too much damage is done. And either outcome is superior to remaining in a dysfunctional dynamic that slowly erodes your well-being while you wait for change that may never come. Maintain your own consistency regardless of theirs. The fourth strategy for outsmarting the avoidance hot and cold behavior is maintaining your own emotional and behavioral consistency regardless of how the avoidance temperature fluctuates. This consistency serves multiple functions. It protects you from the emotional chaos of mirroring their instability. It provides a stable reference point that makes their pattern more visible, and it communicates that you have an internal center that doesn't shift based on their availability. Most people unconsciously match the avoidance energy, becoming anxious during cold phases and relieved during warm phases, allowing the avoidance behavior to determine their emotional state. This mirroring gives the avoidant control while destabilizing you. Maintaining consistency reclaims that control and anchors you in your own experience rather than in reaction to theirs. Consistency begins with maintaining a stable emotional presentation regardless of whether the avoidant is hot or cold. When they're warm and engaged, you're pleased but not euphoric. When they're cold and withdrawn, you're disappointed but not devastated. You experience a narrower emotional range in response to their behavior because you've stopped allowing their temperature to determine your emotional weather. This doesn't mean suppressing your feelings. It means not organizing your entire emotional life around someone whose availability is unpredictable. You feel your feelings, but you don't amplify them by making the avoidance behavior mean everything about your worth, your future, or the relationship's viability. Maintaining consistency also means keeping your own life structure stable, rather than constantly adjusting it to accommodate the avoidance fluctuations. You maintain your routines, your commitments to friends and activities, and your focus on work and personal growth regardless of what phase the avoidant is in. When they're cold, you don't abandon your life to focus on winning them back. When they're warm, you don't drop everything to maximize time with them before they inevitably withdraw again. Your life has its own structure and rhythm that continues steadily, whether the avoidant is present or absent, engaged or distant. This stability protects you from the chaos of organizing around their inconsistency. The consistency includes maintaining clear communication about your needs and boundaries, regardless of the avoidance response. You don't suppress your needs during warm phases to avoid triggering withdrawal. You don't abandon your boundaries during cold phases, hoping that accommodation will bring them back. You state clearly and consistently what you need from partnership, what behaviors are acceptable and unacceptable to you, and what you're willing and unwilling to tolerate. The avoidance temperature changes don't alter these fundamental requirements because your needs aren't negotiable based on their comfort level. This consistent communication creates clarity about what the relationship requires from both parties. Maintaining consistency also means following through on consequences you've established rather than wavering based on the avoidance current temperature. If you've said you'll reduce your availability if the pattern continues, you do so even when the avoidant is in a warm phase and you're tempted to believe things have changed. If you've established a timeline for seeing meaningful change, you honor that timeline even when the avoidant is temporarily more present. This follow-through on your stated boundaries and consequences builds your own integrity and self-trust, and it communicates to the avoidant that your words mean something, that boundaries stated during conflict don't disappear during reconnection. The consistency includes maintaining your own standards for what constitutes acceptable relationship behavior. The avoidance hot and cold pattern often gradually erodes partners' standards until they're accepting behavior they never imagined tolerating: days of silence, emotional unavailability, and lack of commitment or clarity about the future. Maintaining consistency means checking your current standards against what you know you need from partnership, what you'd advise a friend to accept, and what you believed you deserved before this relationship. When you notice your standards eroding, you consciously recommit to them rather than allowing the avoidance pattern to normalize dysfunction. Maintaining consistency also means keeping an accurate perspective on the relationship rather than allowing the most recent phase to determine your overall assessment. During warm phases, you don't forget the cold phases that preceded them. During cold phases, you don't forget that warm phases exist, but also recognize they're temporary. You maintain awareness of the overall pattern, the frequency and duration of each phase, whether the pattern is stable or worsening, and what percentage of the relationship exists in each temperature. This consistent perspective prevents you from being overly influenced by the present moment and helps you assess the relationship's overall health rather than its current state. The consistency you maintain creates a sharp contrast with the avoidance inconsistency that makes their pattern undeniable. When you're steady and they're fluctuating wildly, when you're emotionally regulated and they're oscillating between extremes of closeness and distance, the dysfunction becomes visible in ways it wasn't. When you are mirroring their chaos, this visibility serves you by making it clear that the problem is their pattern, not your perception. And it sometimes serves the avoidant by showing them what consistency looks like, by modeling emotional regulation they haven't developed, and by demonstrating that their hot and cold behavior is a choice rather than an inevitable feature of relationships. Your consistency ultimately protects you by ensuring that regardless of what the avoidant does, you maintain connection to yourself, your values, your standards, and your life structure. The avoidance pattern can't destabilize you because you're anchored in something more reliable than their availability. This anchoring allows you to stay in the relationship from a position of choice rather than need, to assess whether it serves you rather than simply reacting to each temperature change, and to leave if necessary without having lost yourself entirely to the chaos of accommodating their inconsistency. Your consistency is the foundation that makes all other strategies possible, the stable ground from which you can implement boundaries, establish consequences, and ultimately decide whether this relationship is one you can sustain or one you need to release for your own well-being. Know when to walk away from the cycle. The fifth and final strategy for outsmarting the avoidance hot and cold behavior is developing clear criteria for when to walk away, recognizing the signs that the pattern won't change, and that remaining in the relationship is causing more harm than the connection is worth. Many people remain trapped in cycles with avoidance, not because they don't recognize the dysfunction, but because they don't trust themselves to leave, don't believe they've given enough chances, and don't want to abandon someone they love. But knowing when to walk away is an act of self-respect and self-preservation that acknowledges some patterns can't be loved into changing, and that your well-being matters more than your hope that the avoidant will eventually become who you need them to be. Walking away becomes necessary when the pattern continues without genuine effort from the avoidant to address it. If you've communicated clearly about the impact their hot and cold behavior has on you, if you've established boundaries and consequences, if you've given reasonable time for change to occur, and the avoidant continues the pattern without seeking therapy, without doing visible work on their attachment wounds, and without demonstrating sustained different behavior, that's information. It tells you that maintaining their pattern is more comfortable than doing the work required to change it, that they're either unable or unwilling to develop the capacity for consistent presence. At this point, continuing to wait is choosing hope over evidence and fantasy over reality. You know it's time to walk away when you've lost yourself in the process of accommodating their inconsistency. If you no longer recognize who you've become, if your standards have eroded beyond recognition, if you've suppressed so much of yourself to avoid triggering their withdrawal that you feel like a shell of who you were, the relationship is costing too much. No partnership should require you to abandon yourself, to minimize your needs indefinitely, or to accept treatment that violates your core values. When you've sacrificed yourself trying to make the relationship work and it still doesn't, walking away is how you reclaim yourself, how you remember who you are without the distortion of trying to accommodate someone else's dysfunction. Walking away becomes necessary when the pattern is affecting your mental and physical health. If you're experiencing chronic anxiety, if you're not sleeping well, if you're developing stress-related health issues, if you're unable to focus on other aspects of your life because you're consumed with managing the avoidance temperature changes, your body is telling you that this relationship is harming you. The stress of unpredictable intimacy, of never knowing where you stand, and of oscillating between hope and disappointment creates real physiological damage that accumulates over time. Your health and well-being are more important than any relationship, and recognizing when a relationship is making you sick is crucial information that should inform your decision to leave. You know it's time to walk away when you've given more chances than are reasonable and the pattern persists. There's no magic number of chances that's enough. But if you've addressed the issue multiple times, if you've seen the avoidant return to warmth after cold phases repeatedly without the pattern actually changing, and if you've watched the same cycle repeat for months or years, you've given sufficient opportunity for change. Continuing to give more chances at this point isn't patience or commitment, it's self-abandonment. The avoidant has shown you through repeated behavior what they're capable of, and believing it will be different next time when it hasn't been different. The previous times is choosing delusion over acceptance. Walking away becomes necessary when staying requires you to accept a relationship structure that fundamentally doesn't meet your needs. If you need consistency and the avoidant can't provide it, if you need emotional availability and they can't sustain it, if you need commitment and progression and they're comfortable with indefinite ambiguity, that's incompatibility that matters. Love doesn't conquer incompatibility in core relationship needs. All the love in the world doesn't make a relationship sustainable if the structure of how you relate doesn't work for both people. Recognizing that you can love someone and still need to leave them because the relationship itself is incompatible with your well-being is wisdom, not failure. You know it's time to walk away when you're staying from fear rather than from love. If you're remaining in the relationship because you're afraid of being alone, afraid you won't find anyone else, afraid of starting over, or afraid the avoidant will become who you need them to be with someone else, you're not choosing the relationship, you're avoiding the alternative. Staying from fear means you're trapped rather than committed, that you're enduring rather than enjoying, and that the relationship is held together by anxiety rather than by genuine connection and satisfaction. Walking away from fear-based staying and toward intentional choice about how you want to live is liberation. Walking away becomes necessary when you realize you're waiting for potential rather than accepting reality. If you're staying for who the avoidant could become, for the relationship that might exist if they did their work, or for the warm phase you hope will become permanent, you're not in a relationship with the actual person and actual dynamic in front of you. You're in a relationship with your imagination, with possibility, and with the gap between what is and what you hope will be. This gap consumes years of people's lives as they wait for transformation that may never arrive. Accepting reality and walking away from fantasy is how you stop wasting your life on what might be and start living in what actually is. You know it's time to walk away when you've become someone you don't respect in the relationship. If you're tolerating behavior you'd tell a friend to leave, if you're making excuses you don't believe, or if you're staying in ways that violate your own values and standards, the relationship is creating cognitive dissonance that damages your self-respect and integrity. Walking away is how you restore alignment between your values and your actions, how you become someone you can respect again, and how you demonstrate to yourself that your standards aren't just words but actual boundaries you'll enforce even when enforcement is painful. Walking away doesn't require anger, doesn't need dramatic confrontation, and doesn't demand that the avoidant acknowledge everything they did wrong. It can be a calm, clear decision that you've accepted the pattern, you've recognized it won't change, and you're choosing yourself over continuing to accommodate dysfunction. Walking away is recognizing that outsmarting the avoidance hot and cold behavior sometimes means removing yourself from the game entirely, refusing to play a game you can never win, and choosing to invest your energy and love in relationships where consistency is possible and where your needs can actually be met. The smartest response to someone who can't show up consistently isn't figuring out how to make them consistent. It's recognizing when their inconsistency reveals fundamental incapacity and choosing to build your life with people whose patterns support your well-being rather than consistently undermining it. People who don't require you to outsmart their dysfunction because they're committed to addressing it themselves. People whose presence in your life enhances rather than destabilizes you. And people who demonstrate through sustained action rather than temporary warmth that they're capable of the partnership you need and deserve.